Well, we know that the mainstream media is corrupt, dishonest, and both intellectually and morally bankrupt. That is the fundamental reason why, as we've been tracking on the show for the past few weeks, mainstream film critics have refused to review my new film, Am I Racist? But credit where credit is due. A few journalists, even if they aren't film critics, from a few major publications have had the gumption to acknowledge the movie's existence. And yesterday, most unexpectedly, the Washington Post was added to that list. The film critic at the Post, whoever it is, still has not reviewed the film and probably never will. But the journalist Megan McArdle did bravely venture to theaters to watch the movie and wrote about it. Wrote about it mostly positively, it turns out, after the fact. And here's the headline. You might not enjoy Am I Racist? You should watch it anyway. Which I could not agree more. Whether you like it or don't, still watch it. That's my message. Now, even before reading her piece, I'm impressed simply that she's willing to do the thing that people who are paid to watch and write about movies have been too afraid to do. But the readers of the Washington Post are not so impressed. In fact, their reaction demonstrates why most mainstream outlets have been too afraid to venture down this road. And we'll take a look at their reaction in just a moment. But first, let's read a little bit of McArdle's take on the film. She begins, as I drove to the AMC Theater in Danvers, Massachusetts, my phone kept peppering me with the same plaintive question. Am I racist? It was startling the first time it happened, and for a second, I wanted to reassure my phone that no consumer electronic device can't be racist. But the phone wasn't really asking. Rather, it was reminding me that I had tickets for the latest movie by Matt Walsh, a conservative podcaster and provocateur who is probably most famous for his film, What is a Woman? That movie apparently did well enough to justify releasing the new one onto about 1,500 screens this month. It was number 4 at the box office, albeit a distant 4th in a very slow week, which is why I was going to see it. While you might not like this suggestion, you should do the same. FYI, actually, it wasn't a very slow week. Our film came out only a week after Beetlejuice set box office records for the month. And we weren't a distant 4th. We were like 700K behind the 3rd place film, which isn't really distant. And that was Deadpool and Wolverine. But who's counting? I mean, I'm counting obsessively every day, but let's not get hung up on those details. Continuing. I'm not promising you'll enjoy the movie. If you're on the liberal to progressive side, you'll think it's simplistic and unfair, which, yes, obviously. But it's also effective, and people on that end of the spectrum should watch it to understand why it works and why the left keeps providing Walsh such a rich trove of targets. If you don't like the people he's lampooning, it's easy to convince yourself that he's revealing something deep and important, just as I've heard progressives argue that Borat movies were laying bare the hateful underbelly of America. But what Walsh is actually revealing is 2 not very surprising realities of human nature. First, that every group has an awful fringe, and it's easy to make that group look bad if only the fringe's worst moments survive the cutting room floor. Second, that the human instinct for avoiding confrontation is exploitable if you're sufficiently willing to violate the social contract. Both points have already been amply demonstrated by a long history of cults and dictatorships, not to mention middle school. Yet, to give Walsh his due, it's still jaw-dropping when participants in the ersatz diversity workshop sit silently or even participate as he berates a sick-looking elderly man in a wheelchair for being a racist. Walsh eventually stops the workshop when it seems as though they're actually considering flagellating themselves with the whips that he's passed out. So, this is not exactly a rave review. She credits the film for being effective, but also calls it simplistic and unfair. She also attempts to absolve the left of any blame for what we document in the movie. And she does that by writing off, Robin DiAngelo and company as the fringe. Now, as one of the guys who made the film, I, of course, disagree with these assessments. The core message of the film may be, in many ways, simple, but that's not the same as being simplistic. And the Robin DiAngelos of the world are certainly not in any way the fringe of the left. Robin DiAngelo conveys and promotes left-wing racial ideology, not a fringe version of it, but a mainstream version of it. I mean, this is a woman who, as she confesses in the film, is hired by Fortune 500 companies and major government agencies to do workshops for their employees. And calling that fringe, I think, is rather absurd. By analogy, and it's hard to come up with an analogy for the right because nobody on the right has access to those kinds of institutions. But, imagine if Sean Hannity ever found himself in an embarrassing situation and I tried to claim that he's just a fringe right-winger. I mean, say what you want about Sean Hannity, he's definitely not a fringe character on the right. And Robin DiAngelo is considerably less fringe than that on the left. After all, the most mainstream thing a conservative can do is host a show on Fox News. On the left, mainstream means that you're doing work for Coca-Cola and Google and Netflix and so on, which is what Robin DiAngelo says that she's done in the film. And that's the kind of mainstream that Robin DiAngelo and her cronies are. And it's as mainstream as you can get. Okay, I cannot think of anything more Google is like the definition of mainstream. And so if you're getting hired by Google, then you are mainstream. You're the mainstream of the mainstream. On the left, anyway. So I think McArdle is incorrect in some of her analysis, but still, I give her credit for offering any analysis at all, even a wrong analysis. And it's not entirely wrong. So here's how she wraps everything up. A number of the people attending his workshop walk out as the strangeness escalates. And earlier in the film, he gets kicked out of a workshop that someone else runs, but that happens only after he leaves the room, giving participants time to figure out who he is and reach consensus on expelling him. Most people sit through his provocations because, well, it would be rude to leave or point out how bizarre his suggestions are. That itself is telling, however, because some of his targets are also exploiting those same conciliatory social instincts, which is what makes the movie's jokes land. When progressive activist Saira Rao monologues about the awfulness of white women to a group of white women at one of her race to dinner events, which reportedly cost up to $5,000 to stage, the faces of the guests foreshadow those of Walsh's workshop participants, the frozen anxiety of someone witnessing a social offense and unwilling to return it in kind. That's also what you see on the face of celebrity diversity consultant Robin DiAngelo when a bewigged Walsh gives all his cash to a black producer as reparations and invites DiAngelo to do the same. I dropped my head into my hands as DiAngelo went scurrying for her wallet, though I confess I also laughed, because you can't help think of how many times DiAngelo has been paid for advice on how white people ought to interact with people of color, and some of that advice is only slightly less bizarre and patronizing than suggesting we haul out our wallets and tip them $20. DiAngelo and Rao and a number of others gained money and fame during the Great Awakening because decent people, genuinely concerned about America's racial divides, were too polite to point out that they sounded like lunatics. Those well-intentioned Americans had their social instincts hacked, the machinery diverted into a continuous loop of unproductive navel-gazing instead of the racial justice they were trying to achieve. That's what left them vulnerable when Matt Walsh showed up to exploit the same bug. Now, that's her main takeaway, and she's right. What we attempted to do in the film, successfully, I think, is tap into the same exploitation and manipulation methods that these DEI race hustlers use and turn it against them. And if McArdle noticed that, then she understood the basic point of the film, even if I could quibble with some of her analysis, but the basic thrust of it, she understood and is articulating, I think, very well. Her readers, though, are doing quite a bit more than quibbling with her analysis. In fact, they are offended that she's offering any kind of analysis at all. So I perused the comment section on the Washington Post website, and I'll give you a brief sampling, enough to kind of get the basic gist. And as I read these, I'm going to ask our editors to put some sad piano music in the background in order to really capture the vibe of these distraught commenters who have been betrayed by this movie review from a journalist. Here's what they have to say. Just reading a few. Yeah, I'm going to give my money to someone who fights everything I support. If he was being sincere in doing the work, that would be one thing. But to pay to see a mockumentary about racism from an alt-right Trumper? To put money in that guy's pocket? To go to see this to, as they say, own the libs as a liberal? Well, that's an easy pass. Another says, my God, the depth of your stupidity and that of Walsh is deeply, truly staggering. Or is it just pure bigotry? Or is it just running a con on suckers for money? We know why moronic movies like this work. It's because they have a huge propaganda apparatus constantly lying to these people. And that includes grifters like you. It's because they were raised by people unconcerned with truth or facts or history or empathy with others. And many were told this was just God's will. We should give a person money who has openly supported theocracy and fascism so we can understand? Should I donate money to Nazis so I can understand? The next one says, trying to justify and normalize racism has been the goal of the right for years. Now they have a WaPo opinion writer going to lengths to explain racism is okay because the fringe left has some crazy people? Nice try. Another says, so he's not sincere, therefore is a racist and thinks this is all something to laugh about. Why would you support and promote this project, Miss McArdle? Unless you yourself are happily and openly racist too. Y'all are effing weird. Another says, I didn't know anything about Matt Walsh, the person that created the movie recommended here by Megan McArdle. I would have more respect for McArdle in the post if I had never read this column, if I had never known anything about Matt Walsh. And another says, Walsh's last movie was utterly repugnant. If you paid to watch another movie by him for anything other than science or journalism, you just might have a problem. And one more, this grifter movie has nothing to do with racism. It's about owning the libs and getting famous and rich off the MAGA goobers who will confirm their biases. So pretty much like all the rest of the current Republican cult from the orange leader down. Now I have to say, I really take exception to that last comment. He says the movie isn't about racism, it's actually about getting rich and famous. But why can't it be about racism and getting rich and famous? I mean, two things can be true at once, right? We could kill multiple birds with one stone here. And as for the rest of these comments, the most important thing to keep in mind is that these are people who have not seen the movie. They object to anyone seeing it at all. They didn't even pay attention to McArdle's analysis. It didn't matter what her analysis was. In their minds, she betrayed them simply by watching it. I mean, this is the cult mentality that you find on the left. And although the right has plenty of issues of its own, you don't find anything quite like this on our side. You know, conservatives would not get angry at a right-wing commenter for watching a Michael Moore movie and offering a perspective on it. In fact, you know, if there's a new Michael Moore movie out, which there hasn't been in a long time, and people are talking about it and the left is celebrating it, I think if you're a right-wing commentator, you're actually kind of expected to watch it so that you can give your take on it, because your audience wants to know. They want to know, like, what do you think about this thing? And indeed, pretty much every movie Hollywood churns out, documentaries and narrative features, are made by raging leftists. As a conservative commentator myself, I don't have to worry that my audience will dogpile me if I watch a movie and give my thoughts on it. You find this attitude on the left for two basic reasons. The first is that their worldview is a brittle, fragile thing. It cannot withstand any serious or even not so serious challenge, which means they have to steadfastly avoid anything that might challenge it. C.S. Lewis once wrote that a young man who wishes to remain a sound atheist cannot be too careful of his reading. And the same could be said about a young man or a woman, or an old man or woman who wishes to remain a sound leftist. But the other thing that comes out in these comments, and also in the backlash that YouTube reviewer Jeremy Johns experienced when he dared to notice that my movie exists, is that many on the left have come to believe that they own the art form of film itself. If you're on the right, you've long since grown accustomed to the fact that, as we just established, virtually every movie you've ever seen was made by people who disagree with you and probably hate you. Leftists have had the exact opposite experience, and this has given them a sense of kind of artistic entitlement. They believe that art belongs to them. Conservatives who make art are treated as intruders, as burglars, kind of sneaking through the window in the middle of the night. The only appropriate response is to kind of shoo them away. They don't belong here. Art is not for them. That's the attitude. And it's a delusion that I'm quite happy to break, I have to say. I will say, though, that I did find one comment on the Washington Post website from somebody who says they actually watched the film. And here's what the comment says. Quote, I went out of my way to see it last week. What a horrible excuse for a movie. Like watching MLK on steroids. Now, I promise you, I did not make that comment up. This is someone insulting me by, I guess, calling me MLK on steroids. I don't know if he means that I'm like MLK but extremely muscular, or if he means that in a more kind of philosophical sense, that I'm like a civil rights pioneer turned up to the nth degree. Maybe he means it in both ways. I'm a muscular, turbocharged civil rights icon. I can only assume that's what he's trying to say. And All I can say to that is guilty as charged. Perhaps if we do a sequel in the next film, I'll pass around a petition to change the Martin Luther King Jr. monument to the Matt Walsh monument. And it's an idea worth considering, at least. So that comment was obviously correct and deeply, deeply rational, I think. But the other ones, not as much. And that is why the Washington Post readers who are having a heart attack because somebody watched my movie are all today canceled. If you'd like to see what else I have to say, you can access my full show by going to dailywire.com or by going to the Matt Walsh Show Twitter page. Hope to see you there. Godspeed.